From darkness to light, this is the story we all share as the people of God. He draws us out to draw us in. From the birth of Israel to the church today, God delivers and dwells with his people. This story began several thousand years ago, and it began with a promise from God to Abraham that he would make his offspring more numerous than the stars in the sky, a great nation who would one day dwell in the promised land. More than 400 years passed, and Abraham's descendants had not seen this promise fulfilled. Instead, the Israelites lived as foreigners in the land of Egypt. Fearing that the Hebrews would grow into a mighty nation and overtake them, the Pharaoh of Egypt forced them to work as slaves. But Israel continued to grow. In response, the Egyptians increased their oppression of God's people, and Pharaoh gave a terrible decree. Every son born to the Hebrews would be thrown into the river. But a Levite couple defied this order, trusting God's will for their son's life. And God did have a plan for this child. Pharaoh's daughter found the baby and took pity on him. She named him Moses because he was drawn out of the water. As Moses grew older and saw the suffering of his people, anger burned within him. When he witnessed an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, Moses killed the man and fled Egypt to hide in the desert. Years passed, and Moses made a new life for himself in Midian. Then one day the voice of the Lord called out to him from a burning bush. God told Moses that he saw the persecution of his people in Egypt, and he heard their cries. He promised to deliver the Israelites from slavery, and he commanded Moses to go before Pharaoh on their behalf. Moses was terrified, so God sent Moses' brother Aaron to go with him. The brothers went before Pharaoh, performing signs and wonders, but Pharaoh would not listen, so God brought down plagues upon Egypt. Yet Pharaoh's heart remained hard as stone. To prepare for the 10th and final plague, the Hebrews marked their doors with the blood of spotless lambs. That night, the angel of death passed through the kingdom, killing the firstborn child of every Egyptian household that did not bear the mark, including Pharaoh's. Heartbroken, Pharaoh told the Israelites to go. They were finally set free, and the Spirit of God led the people out and toward the promised land. But Pharaoh's grief soon turned to rage. He changed his mind and then commanded the Egyptian army to pursue them. When the Israelites came to the Red Sea, Moses lifted his staff to the sky and the waters parted. The Hebrews passed through the towering waves, and the Egyptians were swallowed by the sea. The Israelites found themselves in a harsh wilderness. Though they had just witnessed God's power and might in rescuing them, the people doubted their deliverer would provide, and instead complained of hunger and thirst. A few days later, they found manna on the ground, sweet and good to eat. And the Lord told Moses to strike a rock with his staff, giving them water to drink. The Lord had provided yet again. As the Israelites approached Mount Sinai, Moses delivered a word from God. If they obeyed and kept God's covenant, God would make them his treasured possession, a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. And the people promised to do so. 3 days later, the mountain shook as a sound like a trumpet grew louder and louder. Then the Lord came down in fire and smoke. When the people heard God's voice, they grew afraid, and they asked Moses to speak with God on their behalf. God gave Moses many laws and instructions, including the 10 Commandments. And the Hebrews promised to worship the Lord alone and to keep his laws. Moses spent 40 days and nights on the mountain with God and returned to find the people bowing down to an idol. They had forgotten their promise. Moses burned the idols and atoned for the people's sin. And though God punished the Israelites, he did not destroy them completely. After the Israelites repented of their unfaithfulness, they went to work making everything that the Lord had instructed. They sewed fine garments for Aaron and his sons and consecrated them with oil for their service as priests. They built the Ark of the Covenant to hold the tablets of the law, and also built the tabernacle where God would dwell with his people. Yahweh, the one who drew them out of slavery. And though the Israelites would endure more strife and hardship, they continued on in hope toward the promised land. The story of Israel is the story of us today. We are God's people. He draws us out to draw us in. And like the Israelites, we still await the promised land in the midst of our sin and suffering. Yet God is with us.
All right, I'm going to pray, and we're going to be done for the day. just kidding. Man, that video is so encompassing of where we're headed as a church. Like, we're jumping into the series, Exodus. He draws us out to draw us in. And this series has been on the docket now for well over a year. In fact, when we decided kind of in the late fall of 2021 that we were going to be doing Genesis in the summer of 2022. Wait a minute, are we in 2022 right now? So 2020, the late fall of 2020, like these years, is it just me or do they just like all blend together now? Yeah, it's just like a clump of years. In the late fall of 2020, we decided we're going to go through Genesis in the summer of 2021. And when we made that decision, we decided at the same time that we would go through Exodus in the summer of 2022 because all that's packed in to Exodus. And as we were preparing for this series together, and I got to tell you, part of me is nervous to tell you how long we're going to be here because I don't want to scare you away, but it's going to be a long time, okay? It's like 31 weeks. 31 weeks, we're going to camp out in the book of Exodus. We're going to break it up into two parts, so there might be a little bit of maybe a quick hitter in between the two, but by and large, we're going to be camped out here for a long time. And as we were planning for and preparing for this journey together, when you're doing a 31-week journey, there's a lot of preparation that comes into that. We were able to accumulate a lot of resources along the way, and we want to make those resources available to you as well. So if you pull out your note sheet real quick, you got that on the way in, and you see that QR code at the bottom that has the cute little dinosaur. We tried to get rid of the dinosaur, but we couldn't, so there it is. It's adorable. And that QR code, if you'll just, real simple, if you have a smartphone, all you have to do is take out your camera, point it at that QR code. It'll give you a quick link. You hit on it. And then week after week, so you're going to see the document there. It's split up into two different sections. One is sermon resources, and the other one is series resources. So the series resources, those are going to be there throughout the whole series. And these are resources that we're using as we build this out, as we journey together as a staff. Whoever's communicating, those are the resources we're using. And they are so readily available. We want them in your hands as well so that you can do your own study. You can do your own journey as slow as you like, as fast as you like. And I think if you do, you're going to so enrich our time together by spending time on your own, going through it as well. And then along with the series resources, you'll see that there are sermon resources. So those are particular videos or thoughts or blogs that we'll post there for the specific message of the week. So week after week, you're going to see that QR code down there and check in and utilize those resources. Like, I'm so grateful for for the Village Church. They're out of Texas. And as we were planning for this series, oftentimes what we'll do, maybe you wonder, like, how do we come up with what we're going to talk about? Well, we start by praying about it, and we have a team, and we start talking about where do we need to go as a church? Like, what should we be thinking about? What do we need to be teaching about? So we have these conversations. We call them whiteboard collab sessions, where we just throw ideas at the board and see what sticks. And then we start to narrow things down from there. And then once we kind of have a general idea of where we're going, sometimes we'll jump online and we'll take a look at, has anybody ever done this before? Get some creative ideas because of stuff other people have done. Well, in the process of doing Exodus, we stumbled upon the Village Church, again, out of Texas. We stumbled on their stuff, and we're like, wow. Like, they did an incredible, like, they built a whole website on their series. They did it, like, back in 2016. So we reached out to the Village Church, and we just said, hey, is there any way that we could get some of your resources? And they said, you can have it all, whatever you want. Just take it, use it. So the video that we just watched, that came out of their church. And how cool is it to be a part of the global church that says, man, we care about equipping disciples everywhere, and we're going to give away our stuff in order for people all the way up in North Idaho so that they can be blessed by it, so they can learn by it and be challenged through it. So I'm so thankful for them. And Bible Project, it's another resource that you're going to see inside of that QR code. Bible Project, they do phenomenal work, and I want to expose you to their work as much as possible because they are doing they're a crowdsourced nonprofit. Like, they're creating videos to help us, just common folk, learn and understand the scriptures better. So thankful for all of these resources and scholars who help shape my understanding of the scriptures. You know, as a carpenter by trade, a preacher by call, most of my time was spent swinging a hammer, not inside of a classroom. So I'm thankful for those scholars who have gone before and who give out their resources so that I can be equipped to help equip you guys for the work that Jesus has us doing. So handing out those resources, that's our way just to push it out there and say, listen, anybody, if this carpenter can learn from these people, so can you. So take on your learning journey yourself, utilize those resources, jump in. I think you'll really be glad that you do. Now, maybe you're wondering why Exodus? Like, why are we going through the book of Exodus? Well, Exodus is a continuation of Genesis. We're going to talk more about this next week in the message. We'll unpack this some more, but really it's just a continuation. So when we said we're going to teach our way through Genesis in the summer of 2021, it only made sense to then teach through the book of Exodus in 2022. And I had this harebrained idea at one point that we would teach all the way through the Torah in 5 years. But if you've ever read Leviticus, I'm telling you, I don't have the chops for that quite yet. Okay? I just don't. So we're going to do Genesis, and we're going to do Exodus. But this Exodus, it's the second part of what's called the Pentateuch or the Torah. The Torah is the Hebrew word for law. The Pentateuch is literally means 5 books or 5. One book, 5 parts is essentially. So if you take the first 5 books of the Old Testament, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, this makes up the Torah or the Pentateuch. Those are synonymous terms. And they help give us such a crystal clear picture of who God is. So Exodus is the second part, or the second volume, maybe is another way to say it, a second volume of the Pentateuch. And inside of the book of Exodus, God reveals so much about who he is. Like, he reveals himself in such a personal way throughout this book of Exodus. And as we work our way through it, I started to think, as I was preparing for this morning, I started to think, it's one thing to know about someone, right? And it's a whole other thing to really know someone, isn't it? Like, we could probably go around the room and we could list off several names of people whom we know of. And then the list of people who we really truly know, that list gets a lot shorter, a lot smaller along the way. I remember when Heidi and I first met way back in youth group. It was a long time ago. We were both students in youth group. And we met one another, and it was a really brief encounter. So Heidi has this story that she walked up to a circle that I was standing in, and I was talking to some people, and she walked up to be a part of that circle. And she says, and I believe her because she doesn't tell fibs, she says that I said when she walked up, "Who invited you here?" Now, I don't know if I've quite talked her into it yet, but I told her if I in fact said that, I only said that as like I was flirting with her. Now, granted, I had no game. Okay? I had no game. So she walks up, obviously, pretty girl, and young Nate throws his foot in his mouth by trying to be fun and like, "Who invited you here?" Well, Heidi's personality, she's like, she just walks out of the circle, and for the next couple of years, Heidi and I spend our time knowing about each other. We just knew about each other. And you know what we did? We filled in the gaps with all of our assumptions about each other. So it was a bunch of assumptions based on information we didn't have about one another. But don't we do that as people? Like, we have this idea of who someone is, and in a vacuum of real known qualities about that person, we fill in the gaps, don't we? So here's kind of the gaps that I filled in. Man, that Heidi Williams, she's really stuck up. Like, she doesn't ever talk to anybody. Like, she never talks to me. And Heidi filled in the gap with that Nate Day. He's a real jerk. Like, I tried to have a conversation with him, and he said this, and I don't want any part of that. Like, he is such a jerk. And then there was this beautiful Christmas Eve party. She walks up the stairs. It's like I saw her for the first time again. And somehow the walls dropped down, and she didn't see me as a jerk any longer, but she saw me as somebody she might want to have a conversation with. And over the next really several years, and now for the rest of our lives happens to be, we began to get to know one another. And instead of making assumptions about each other, what we did was we spent long time in the evenings on the phone. You know, back in the day when the phone was still connected to the wall. And when you're having those kinds of conversations, you don't want anybody else to hear them. So thankfully, we had about 12.5-foot cord on our phone. So I'd take it off the wall, I'd dial a number, I'd walk out onto the back porch. It didn't matter how cold it was. And I would sit out there for hours. And we would talk on the phone, you know, slide the sliding glass door shut on your way out and just talk forever. And I remember walking back in, and my dad would be like, "What on earth have you been talking about for that long?" What we were doing was we were beginning to close the gaps. Like, we were beginning to have conversations, beginning to learn about one another in a brand new way, learning for the first time, like, some of those assumptions we made really weren't true. Like, as I began to dialogue and have conversation with Heidi, I realized she wasn't stuck up at all. And as she had conversations with me, she realized that he's not really complete jerk. He's just partially a jerk. And the truth of the matter is we do the same thing with God. And if Heidi and I had continued on with our assumptions about one another, we would never be almost 25 years married, 4 kids, right? We would never have this life that we have together, this bond, this intimacy with one another. It would have never happened if we stayed with our assumptions. But we push past our assumptions to really get to know somebody. And the same is true with our relationship with God. We have to push past our assumptions and really get to know God for who God is. See, when we come to this conversation about Creator God, oftentimes we bring our baggage to the conversation, don't we? We make assumptions about who God is. Maybe we've heard some things along the way. Maybe late one night you were sitting down in front of a TV and you saw a TV evangelist come up on there and told you a couple things about God. Maybe you were grown up in a church that was very centered on laws and rules, and you can't do this and you can't do that, and that kind of shaped and formed your perspective of God. Like I don't know what your background with God is, but my guess is you walked into this room this morning, or you're listening online, and you have formulated some assumptions about who God is. But this is what I know to be true about assumptions. Generally, I assume wrong. When I am left to just have my own assumptions, I generally assume wrong. And most of the time, if you get down to conversations with people who are not followers of Jesus, and you ask them, what is your sticking point with Jesus? Why don't you follow him? Generally, this is what I've found, is they have a wrong assumption of who God is. They've rejected God because they have a wrong assumption. They have wrong thoughts about who God is. They only have ideas. They don't have a holistic picture or a holistic perspective of who God is. They've created for themselves these characters or caricatures of God. For example, God is a genie God. And as I walk along in life, if I need something, all I have to do is cry out to him and he magically appears and he gives me the 3 desires of my heart. You can have any 3 wishes you want. What are they? We have this idea of this genie God, or how about this? Craig Rochelle talks about the goosebump God. And for me, as I found Jesus as a middle schooler and high schooler, most of my first decade of serving Jesus was all about the goosebump God. I wanted to get in an environment where I felt the goosebumps. I just felt this is what, this emotional response to whatever it was, either the teaching or the worship, and this goosebump God, that God is there to make me feel good. Maybe that's the God that we've created. Man, there's real problems when that's the God you've created, because what happens when the goosebumps go away? And I found myself in my early 20s, really wrestling with my faith. Man, the goosebumps are gone. God must be gone also. See, that exposed, I had a misunderstanding of the character of God. I didn't really understand who God was. What I'd taken was some snidbits along the way, posted them together or molded them together in order to create this God who wasn't really God. Or maybe you have this cosmic killjoy God in your mind. That God is this cosmic killjoy. He is up there, and his one and only goal is to make sure we have no fun down here. And some of you, you wanted to laugh there, but you're I don't know, I don't want to, that's my view of him, and I don't want anybody else around me to know that. We've all had that view. We've all had that view, man, God, why do you have to call that off limits? Why can't I do that? I would love to go do that, right? So this cosmic killjoy, his only goal is to make sure we have no fun, or maybe here's another one that many people hold as this distant God. Yeah, there was a creator who intelligently designed this world and created human beings, but really he has no part of humanity, doesn't really care about them, is not intimately involved with them. He's just distant and removed, this deist kind of a God where he's distant and removed and he doesn't care about us. And as we've sketched out some of those, again, I could keep going with examples of the kind of God or the caricatures of God that we can make. But what matters is why this is so important to us here and now. And the reason why this is so important for us to get our arms around is because a right understanding of God is imperative for us to navigate this life well. It should be on the screen behind me. It's going to hang out there for a few minutes because I really want you to grasp this. This is one of the reasons why we are doing this series together, is because a right understanding of God is imperative for us to navigate life well. We have to understand Creator God. A wrong understanding of God gets us in trouble every time. Every time. But a right understanding helps guide us and direct us, helps us navigate life well. And the only way to get a right understanding of God is by who God reveals himself to be to us. We can make a lot of assumptions. We can read a lot of books, and I encourage you to read great books with scholarly minds, right? Fathers of the faith, people who have gone before us. They have wonderful things to say. But none of that can replace us spending time with God ourselves, like the scriptures. This is the way that God chose to reveal himself to people. So if we want to have a right understanding with God, we have to start with the scriptures. We have a high view of the scriptures at Canvas Church. This is the last court of arbitration, if you will. Like, this is where we go for it all. And inside of the scriptures, that God, through the Holy Spirit, empowering human authors, penned these words so that we could know who he is. Think about all of the time, effort, and energy that it took for God to have these written and then preserved throughout all time, so that here in 2022, we could sit in a room like this, or you could, in your comfort of your home, or standing in the grocery line with a phone app on your phone, that you can know the God of the scriptures. It's phenomenal, isn't it? It's amazing. And I'm so grateful for the scriptures that are going to guide us and direct us, because a right understanding of God is imperative for us, you and I, to navigate this life well. And this morning we're going to be in Exodus chapter 3, verses 13 through 15. And we're here because this is our theme verse. So this is the theme verse for all of the book of Exodus. Our whole journey together is found right here in Exodus 3, 13 through 15. Now, I'm going to just catch you up to speed real fast, but don't worry, we're coming back to this in a little while. In a few weeks, we'll be right back at this spot. But just let me catch you up to speed real fast. Israel has been in Egypt as slaves for over 400 years now. And God has looked down and he's seen them being oppressed. And he calls Moses, the one who was drawn out of the water, he calls Moses to go liberate his people. So this is at the burning bush. Maybe you're familiar with that story. Maybe you've seen a movie about it. Maybe you've read it for yourself, or you've read a kid's book. But you have some familiarity. This moment where Moses is standing at a bush that's on fire, but the bush is not being consumed, because this is God showing up to have a conversation with Moses, and he's calling Moses to go deliver his people out of the oppression of the Egyptians. And you can imagine, if you're having a conversation with God and he's calling you to do something very dangerous, very radical, something that is so far outside of is so far off Moses' radar, it seems. Like, this was on his radar at one point, and we'll read about that, where Moses, early in his life, he kills an Egyptian. So he had the beginnings of what God was calling him to, but he jumped the gun a little bit. He just jumped the gun. He went before somebody said go. And because of that, he ends up in Midian, as a sojourner, as a foreigner or an alien in a land for 40 years. And then God revisits him, and he wants him to know, I've called you to this and I'm sending you back. But Moses is like, that was so long ago. I totally wanted to do that, but that was 4 decades ago. Right now? So Moses has some questions for God. And it's inside of those questions that we get this text that we're in right now. Exodus 3:13. It says this: Then Moses said to God, if I come to the people of Israel and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask me, what is his name? What shall I say to them? That's a great question, isn't it? I think Moses has a lot of foresight here. And God says to Moses, this is so important. God says to Moses, I am who I am. I am who I am. And he said, say this to the people of Israel, I am has sent me to you. And God also said to Moses, say this to the people of Israel, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob has sent me to you. And I really want to hone in on this statement right here, because this is really the crux. This is why we're having this conversation for the next several months together. This is my name forever, and thus I am to be remembered throughout all generations. In this moment, is the first time God introduces himself to humanity in this very personal way. It's a very personal way. Moses in front of the bush, like, who should I tell him sent me? If I go there and have a conversation, who should I tell them sent me? And God says, I am. Tell them I am sent you. Now that word I am in Hebrew is yeah. Just like that. That's what that means. And you can imagine how weird it would be for Moses to show up and say, who sent you to us? And him say, I am. Right? Because that's in the first person. So when God addresses Moses, he says it in the first person, sent you. Like, I am sent you. What is this I am? That is what it is. Like, I am. I always have been, I am today, and I will be. That's really what's wrapped up in this word, I am. Who I am right now is who I have always been and who I always will be. So he goes on to tell Moses, he says, go tell them I am sent you. And then he changes it and he says, go tell them the Lord. Now, this is really important. Like, this is such great information. You're going to find some resources inside the tab for you to dive deeper on this. Inside of the Bible, most American translations, most English translations, I should say, inside of there, maybe you've noticed this before when you're reading. You read along, and there's sometimes the Lord is all capitalized. The word Lord is all capitals. Capital L, capital O, capital R, capital D. And then sometimes it's capital L, and it's lowercase, right? O-R-D, and sometimes it's just lowercase l, all lowercase, right? Why do they move it around all the time? Well, they move it around because when God says to Moses again, go tell them the Lord sent you, it's all capitals. What he is saying is, go tell them Yahweh sent you. And Yahweh means he is. I am, he is. So this is the third person version of God's personal name. And this becomes the personal pronoun for God all along the way. In fact, we really don't know because they only wrote in consonants back in those days. And we're going to dive into this deeper, but let me just give you a quick little snippet. Back in those days, they only used the consonants, they didn't use the vowels. So we don't know exactly what vowels actually fit into the word Yahweh. That's the best guess the scholars have. And they were so in tune to not misusing the name of God over the generations, they stopped pronouncing it at all. So when they would come to those consonants, YHWH, they would replace that, not in writing, but they would replace it with, like if they were reading out loud, they would use the word Adonai. Adonai, maybe you've seen that before, or you've recently sung it because we're singing a song with these names of God. That word Adonai is just the Hebrew word for Lord. It's Lord, and Lord means master. So the name of God is not actually God. God is just simply a title. It's a title. That's all it is. It's a title. It's deity. That's essentially what God is. It's this title, deity. And in Exodus chapter 3, God reveals himself to humanity as a personal God, and his name is Yahweh. And Yahweh is on a mission here. Yahweh is on a mission to reveal his name to us, to reveal his character, and to reveal his purposes to his people. Now, God's desire to reveal himself to people, this isn't like divine narcissism. It's not like I need everybody to know my name down there, and I'm going to make sure you all know my name. No, it's not divine narcissism, but God being creator of it all, knowing that he created us on purpose, for a purpose, and our purpose is to worship him. He is the sustainer of all life. He knows that the life he created us to live is found in knowing him. Like, we can do a lot of life outside of him, and I promise you, it will never be as good as doing life with him. So when we really know who this God is, it allows us to dive deeper in love with him, knowing him better. God is the source of all life for humanity. And inside of the New Testament, we see Jesus saying this, I have come that you might have life and have it more abundantly. So in Exodus, we get some of the best pictures of Jesus and what Jesus is going to be up to in a couple of thousand years, right? In a couple of thousand years, Jesus is going to hit the scene. But we get such a beautiful picture of Jesus in the book of Exodus. And because of that picture of Jesus, we can kind of transpose these words that life abundantly is found in knowing and understanding who Yahweh is, which directs us towards who Jesus is. And in fleshing out this concept, Tim Mackey of the Bible Project, he said this: to know the name of Yahweh means to understand this God's character, what this God cares about. So to know the name of God is to understand the character of God. And throughout Exodus, we are going to be learning so much about who Yahweh is. We're going to be learning about his character. And for the next several minutes here this morning, I want to walk us through 4 themes that we're going to see over and over again throughout the book of Exodus. And in fact, these themes, you can trace them all the way throughout the scriptures in general. But particularly talking about Exodus, these 4 themes that we're going to see over and over again throughout the Exodus journey together. And I want to point out some of the implications it has on our lives. So these are 4 reoccurring and revealing themes that we find in Exodus. Number 1 is this: God is present. God is present. God hears, God sees, and God knows. This God is present is wrapped up in this God sees, God hears, and God knows. We see that in the book of Genesis, and now we see it in the book of Exodus, where God looks down. People are being oppressed by the Egyptians. They're afraid that the Israelites are going to be able to overcome them because they're becoming such a great nation. And because of that, they decide to oppress them. And it says that God looks down and he sees them. And he hears them. And he's going to respond to them. In fact, we see God walking as a cloud in the day and a pillar of fire by night. His presence is with the Israelites as they journey their way through the book of Exodus. God is absolutely present in the people of Israel. And he promises that he's present with us here today as well. God says, I will never leave you nor forsake you. So the same God who walked with Israel way back then is the same God who walks with us today, here and now. And it begs the question, what would change if we actually believe that God sees us and God hears us? And that word actually is highlighted in bold, because I bet if we were to go around the room, a large majority of in this place would say, yeah, we believe that God hears us and sees us, but yet our actions our actions betray our stated beliefs. And this has been said throughout all of time. Our actions are an actual indicator of our beliefs, not just our words. So what would it change if we actually believed that God sees us and God hears us? That no matter where we're at in our work week, no matter where we're at, there's no corner you can hide in. There's no place you can run away from God. Like, God is always present. Like, what would change if we actually believe God hears us? Another thing that we're going to discover along the way, we're going to run into it multiple times along the way here, is God is faithful. God is faithful. He keeps his promises. Like, Exodus is something that God promised several chapters ago. You flip back all the way to Genesis chapter 15, and you see, in fact, the first promise is back in Genesis chapter 12, I believe. Maybe it's 9. I'm getting confused right now, but right in that general vicinity is God's first promise to Abraham that I'm going to make you into a great nation. It's a beautiful promise. And then in Genesis chapter 15, he reinstates that promise with a covenant. But he tells Abraham at that point, listen, I'm going to give you the promised land, but before you get there, you're going to spend 400 years in captivity. You're going to spend 400. Like, God saw it. And over those 400 years, God didn't just forget about Israel. God heard them. God saw them. God remembered his promise. And what does he do? He shows up. He shows up by calling Moses to go deliver his people. And then we're going to see over and over again where God shows up and God remains faithful to his people. They end up at the shore of the Red Sea. Can't go any further this way. Pharaoh's armies coming in hot pursuit behind them. It's like you've got two really bad options. You have death or death. Bad options, right? The answer to that is yes, those are bad options. And what we see is God in his sovereignty and in his power and in his faithfulness make a way where there seemed like there was no way. See, God is faithful, and we see this all throughout Scripture, that God is faithful to unfaithful people. Like God chooses to be faithful not because we're good, he just does it because he's a faithful God. And then it makes me ask this question, how would truly believing God keeps his promises affect the way we live our lives? Like, how would truly believing God keeps his promises? Like, God, you do. Like, Jesus, when you said that you're going away to prepare a place for those of us who are followers of you where we could live for eternity, that you're going to do that. And you promised that if you were going to go do that, that you wouldn't leave us as orphans, but you would come back and you'd get us and you would take us to that place. Like, how would that change the way we live right now? Like, if we really believe that, I just gotta believe that I would be more passionate about reaching those who don't know Jesus. Like, if I really believed the faithfulness of God, when my heart wants to be overran with anxiety, that I would remind myself that God has been faithful in the past, he's going to be faithful in this moment, and he is going to see this thing through. I think it would radically change the way we live our lives when we believe God keeps his promises. Number 3 is this. The third theme we see in God's character is this: God liberates people. He liberates people. God liberates. Freedom is found in following Yahweh. Freedom is found in following Yahweh. And again, we see this all the way back in the beginning. God creates the garden and he tells Adam and Eve, you can have everything except for that tree. He says, that's not good. That's not good. He puts them to the test. Are you going to trust me? Are you going to trust me to be your liberator? Are you going to trust me to bring freedom for you? Or are you going to go about life your own way? The same test is there for us today. And we see it over and over again throughout Exodus, where Israel comes into test after test after test. And what God is doing in those tests is not trying to make them stumble and fall. He's trying to help them realize, trust me, I am the liberator. Like, we see God liberate Israel out of the oppression of the Egyptians. He literally sets them free. He sets them free. And inside of that set-free picture, you and I can place ourselves right in that story. And I can look back when I was 12 years old and I came into relationship with Jesus, that on that day, Jesus set me free. He set me free from my sin. He drew me out of my sin and into relationship with him. Why? Because God liberates people. That's why. And because God liberates people, what would happen if we really believed that Jesus purchased our complete freedom on his own? What if we truly believed that God purchased our freedom through Jesus Christ alone? There is no more freeing fact than that one right there. See, when I recognize that Jesus purchased my freedom, it allows me to be 100% honest with who I am. Because my identity is not wrapped up in how good I am, what I get accomplished, my productivity. It's not wrapped up in any of that. It's wrapped up in the person and the work of Jesus Christ, who paid it all on the cross for me at Calvary. And because of that, I can walk in freedom. I can push my sins out into the light and say, Jesus, you've already paid for these. I don't have to hide them anymore. See, when my identity is built on my goodness, all of the stuff that's not good in me, what do I want to do? I want to hide it under the bed. Like when we were kids and mom and dad said, go clean your room, and we thought they'll never find it under the bed. Like, wow, you got your room cleaned really quickly. How'd that happen? It's fast. And 2.5 seconds later, they lift up the covers, they look under there, it's like, it's all under there. There's nothing clean about this. And that's the way our spiritual lives are as well. When we think our goodness is what buys us a ticket to heaven, when we think it's by our actions and by how well we perform, that's what gets us in good relationship with God, then we tend to take all the other stuff that's not good, and there's plenty of that, and we start stuffing it under the bed. There's no freedom in that. As a little boy standing there waiting for my dad to walk around my room knowing there's a bunch of stuff under the bed, I tell you what, I was not at ease. Heart's just pumping. Like, is he going to find it? Of course he's going to find it. And the same is true with us. When we're just stuffing things under the covers, hopes that God's not going to find it, let me remind you about point number 1, God is present. He sees it and he knows it. But when we recognize that Jesus already paid for it all, we can push it out into the light and we can find true freedom that is found in Jesus. And number 4 is this: God is powerful. God is powerful. We see this throughout Genesis and we see it throughout Exodus. God has the power to create and decreate as he sees fit. He creates this world and it's beautiful, and man turns from God and runs after sin, runs after their own plan, their own agenda. They take autonomy and authority on their own. They decide to define what is good rather than trusting God for what is good, and it sends humanity on this downward spiral, and then we end up at the flood where God says, okay, if you want it your way, you can have it. And decreation happens, and God preserves Noah. And then Noah gets off the boat just shortly after the boat, and he already starts a downward spiral. Like we see this over and over again. And when we show up to the book of Exodus, we see God's power on full display. Like the laws of nature are submitted to the authority of the sovereign will of God. God can take an ocean, the Red Sea, and he can make it stand up on end so that there's a passageway for a couple million people to walk through. That's phenomenal, isn't it? At God's will, at God's word, he can create and he can decreate. The natural order of this universe is at God's command. What if we genuinely believed that God is able? What if we genuinely believed God is able? In fact, maybe it would be helpful if you look back even at the last week of your life, maybe the last month of your life, and some situations that you came up against, and think to yourself, ask yourself this question, like, what if I really believed that God was able? What if I really believed that God was able to meet all of my needs according to his riches and his glory, like it says in the scripture? Like, what if? What if? Like, how would we approach this life if we genuinely believe that God is absolutely able? Then when it says he holds this universe in the palm of his hands, that it's really true. It's really true. What if we believe that God didn't just breathe us into existence, but because he breathes, we still exist? Like, what if we really believe that? How would that change our lives? And this is what my hope is throughout this series, we begin to tie these character themes of God together in a way that's transformational in our lives. If we could have the worship team come at this time as we begin to wrap things up today. And throughout this series, we're going to be going through these themes over and over again. We're going to see splashes of them along the way. And our goal inside of this series is to find ourselves in the story. Find ourselves in the story. So often I can read the book of Exodus and I just shake my head at the Israelites like, you guys are morons. Like, seriously, again? Again? Good practice, good habit. Anytime you read a story in the Bible and you think you guys are morons, put yourself in their position. Just put yourself in their position. And it allows you to read the text with a little bit more empathy. And it allows you not to have a judgmental perspective on those people, because here's the reality. We're those people. We're those people. We're God's people. And as we place ourselves in the story, this is my hope, that we fall deeper in love with this God who draws us out of our sins and into relationship with him. Like, that's my hope. Because I think, call me crazy, but I think that if we lived life from that perspective, so much of life would change. That we would have an incredible impact on the world around us when we really believe that God draws us out of our sin and into a relationship with him. Here's a couple of takeaways. Number one is this. Read Exodus chapter 1, verses 1 through 7. We'll be there next week. So we're going to be front-loading every week so that you can read before you get here. Rather than reading after the fact, you're going to read before you get here. That way you're already caught up to speed on the story, so you can really sit there and lean in and listen to whoever's communicating for the day. So, number one, it's 7 verses. Listen to it. You can do this. You can do it. 7 verses, all right? So read those. And the second one is this. Explore the resources. I hope we don't see a recycling bin out there full of the sermon notes. I hope that most of them are taken home with you today, because you're going to take your camera, you're going to scan that QR code, and you're going to learn on your own about this stuff. So explore those resources. Would you stand to your feet this morning? As is most weeks, we want to take the time to pray with you if you need prayer this morning. No matter what you came in with, if you need prayer, we would love to pray with you. And we're going to have some friends over here on both sides, and they're just off to the side just so that, it's not as much attention drawn on you. People like to fly in the wings, so they're over there. If you need prayer, let them pray with you this morning before you go. I'm going to pray, and then the band's going to sing, and it's a great time for us to reflect. So Jesus, thank you for your word. Thank you for challenging us. I pray that you would prepare our hearts. Give us the discipline, Lord, to really dig in and journey through Exodus as we find out more of who you are and your love for us. In your name, amen.